Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen Knight from Bigfoot Books and Brews in downtown Marion, North Carolina, a new boutique bookstore coffee shop in Marion's downtown social district. And I am so glad to be here with Brian McLaren, author of the new book, The Last Voyage. This is his new novel, the first in a new trilogy. And I'm so excited to talk with you, Brian, about this. But Brian is an activist, an author, a public intellectual, international speaker, and for many years, grateful to call him a dear friend and mentor, someone who I have been grateful to get wise counsel from for many, many years. Brian, it's so good to see you. And
Oh man, always good to be with you, Steve. And on my resume, a friend of Steve Knight is high up there in my book. So our friendship has meant a lot to me. And I'm so glad you're working with this bookstore, and so glad we're having this opportunity to talk today.
yeah, yeah. So for folks who don't already know you and are familiar with your work, what would you like people to know about you and
Sure.
the your work over the past 20 plus years?
Well, I've been married to Grace for getting close to 50 years now. It's in the high 40s. And we have four adult children and five amazing grandchildren. I began my career as a college English teacher, and during that time, I became a pastor, and for a while was a part-time teacher, part-time pastor, and then became a full-time pastor for 24 years. Started writing books during that time, and as you mentioned, I've done a lot of traveling and speaking about related to the things I was writing about. And about 25 years ago, I had my first fiction come out. I had a trilogy that I wrote then. And now, these many years later, I find myself back doing fiction. So I'm also working on, always working on some nonfiction. But this fictional project, the science fiction project, has sort of, it's helped my sanity. I hope it will help other people's sanity to read it, but it certainly helped my sanity to write it during these crazy times.
And we can edit this part out if you want, but you have a personal connection to Western North Carolina. Grateful for that. I mean, we were talking a little bit ago about Hurricane Helene and the aftermath and all of that. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but
Well, the first thing I'd want to say is I've had a personal connection here for a long time of many wonderful friends. I love Western North Carolina. Not only that, I'm a fly fisherman, so I love fishing in the Western Carolina mountains. But for the last several years, my daughter and her partner have lived there, and they love Asheville and Western North Carolina. And even more reason I feel connected. And when Helene came through, of course, I live in Florida, so we'd had a sort of a glance by Helene, but we're familiar with hurricanes. But then watching what it did there, obviously we were on the edge of our seats and we were feeling with you all. And when I was there a few months ago, I walked in a stream bed where I've fished in the past, and the stream bed was scoured down to the bedrock. I couldn't believe just the tonnage of boulders that had been moved. And then I noticed every 10 feet or so were these craters of fragmented rock. And I realized these were where huge boulders were bouncing along the bedrock, rock, just shattering rock. And I just remember it almost sent a shiver up my spine to just feel the immensity of what you all experienced. And so, for everyone in your area, my heart goes out to you. It doesn't leave you, does it? You're changed. Your relationship with the earth is changed through something like that.
yeah, yeah, and it's in like we were saying earlier, it's not unrelated to the
Yeah,
themes and the topics in this new book and in this new trilogy, and talking about the ecological crisis and the frequency of these massive storms that we're
yeah,
experiencing now, extreme heat that we're experiencing right now.
yeah,
It was absolutely a traumatic experience for everyone in this area that I don't think any of us were truly expecting or, imagined like the immensity of it with no
yeah,
power, no internet, no, for weeks and
yeah.
just apocalyptic, really.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
when we so maybe we could segue into
Yes.
the theme of this new book. Tell us about it.
Sure. Well, it's fiction, it's science fiction, and it's probably fits in the category of cli-fi or climate fiction in that it's talking about the impacts on the earth and human beings and human society that are being unleashed by climate change. And obviously, this is an issue that's been important to me for many years. I care about every social issue I possibly can, right? But the thing I realize about the climate is that every other issue we care about is affected by the condition of the planet.
Mm.
And so, things that we maybe spend decades making progress on can be just swept away in a day because of this other issue that's always there and that more and more people are aware of, but we've crossed a lot of tipping points in a negative direction. We haven't crossed the tipping point in being able to make the changes we need to make. So the book takes place about 30 years in the future. And what happens is what is happening now. We have knowledge of the problem, growing awareness of the problem, but the systems of power, the systems of wealth that are currently in place manage to stay in place for the next 30 years. And that means that we don't make the progress we need to make. In fact, we continue losing ground as we currently are. And that leads a couple of what you might call rogue oligarchs who, two oligarchs with a whole lot of money and power to realize that they don't want to play the game anymore. And they decide to try to establish an assurance colony, not only of humans, but of other life forms on Mars. And that's the setting for the novel. I suppose you could say the inciting incident for the novel is that when this group of scientists on Mars starts having the same problems that we're having on Earth, that calls for drastic action. And that's the setting for the novel.
And we've learned pretty quickly that there's something happening that leads to what you call the last voyage.
Yeah. Something happens on Mars and something is happening on the Earth. You find out what happened on Mars at the beginning of the novel. You find out what's happening on Earth at the end of the novel. But what happens is they realize that it's not going to be business as usual. They won't be able to keep sending more missions to Mars to build up this human colony. And meanwhile, the human colony is starting to self-destruct in some very disturbing ways. So what happens is at this last voyage, instead of sending engineers and computer experts, and they realize we have to send artists and ethicists and people with sensitivity to the human predicament. And we also have to send people who care about plants and who care about animals. This sort of last, it's this realization we've been caring about a whole lot of other things and not caring about some things that are deeply important.
And I'm still reading it. I haven't gotten to the end yet, but you have some really great characters.
Oh, thanks.
Your dialogue is like phenomenal. When
Oh,
I think
thank you.
about writing, and it'd be interesting for you to share a little bit about the difference between writing nonfiction versus fiction, but a lot less footnoting with fiction. A lot more footnotes in your nonfiction, Brian. But the depth of the content is, I would say, is very much the same.
Mm.
So many similar themes from your nonfiction writing. But how'd you come up with this story and these
Mm.
characters, and yeah, just where did the inspiration come from?
Well, this might sound fictional, but this is actually true. The day after the election in 2016, I opened a file on my computer and called it The Last Voyage. And I just felt for my own mental health, I needed to indulge in fiction. And I
Mm.
didn't know exactly how it was going to turn out. But what I needed to imagine is Here's what I felt. The election in 2016 was an election to choose an oligarch to be a leader. It was to fuse the power of capitalism and the power of democracy, and to let there be no check and balance between them, but to rather fuse them. And of course, we made that decision again in 2020, in 2024. And you know what? We may have made the same decision in 2020 because the fact is that both of our parties tend to put up wealthy, powerful people to rule in politics. And that's another whole subject. But when I realized that, I had this feeling I need to now try to imagine worst case scenarios.
Mm,
And I wanted to do that with fiction. So I wanted to create characters who would, yeah, be the kinds of people who would be grappling with these issues 30 years in the future.
yeah, yeah. You wrote a book in 2007 called Everything Must Change.
Yes.
And we hosted you in Charlotte for a weekend on that national book tour.
Yeah.
And a lot of what you wrote about in that book was these dire social issues and the climate crisis. I'm thinking about this book now, and it begs the question, have you given up hope, Brian? Or are you saying we have maybe 30 years, but if it doesn't change, then this is the going to be the outcome, something like this.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book that came out last year that in many ways was the sequel to Everything Must Change. It was called Life After Doom. And I define doom not as there's no hope, but I define doom as the feeling that comes over you when you feel that our problems are bigger than our solutions, that our problems have grown bigger than our solutions. And that's a psychological experience that I never had until around 2007 when I was writing Everything Must Change. And I didn't put this in the book. It shows up in the last couple of chapters in Everything Must Change way back in 2007. But I'd been invited to a meeting by an amazing, brilliant economist who I dearly love named David Corton. David wrote The Great Turning, When Corporations Rule the World, Agenda for a New Economy. I think David Corton is an economist who has seen the gravity of our situation. Another economist like that, who I also had the privilege to interview for that book way back in 2007, was Herman Daly, who wrote Beyond Growth. And he was one of the first people who talked about a post-growth economy, which makes no sense to a lot of people, and that's part of the point. But David invited me to a meeting. And what I realized when I was in this meeting is that everyone in the meeting assumed that what we call the global economy was unsalvageable and that we had to imagine that the global economy was going to collapse. And they were trying to imagine the economies that could emerge after the global economy. And when I still remember where I was sitting in the conference room, and I remember thinking, I have never imagined the global economy collapsing. And for these people, it's a done deal. It's going to collapse. It's just a question of when. And and they're already trying to imagine the economies to arise on the other side.
Mm,
And I'll just tell you, it sent a shiver up my spine because I depend on the global economy.
sure.
And since then, I came across a quote by Slavoj Žižek, the European philosopher, and he and someone else has said this as well. But he said it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism.
Hmm. Wow.
And that made me realize why there are so many science fiction books imagining the end of the world, because we've got a set of assumptions and we've built an economy around it. And this economy has brought us incredible benefits, including the ability for you and I to speak on a video conference and record this and distribute it to people. I mean, it used to cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to have the equipment to do what we're doing right now effortlessly from our homes, right? So this global economy has done amazing things, but it also is destroying the earth. And that small detail is a detail that most people are still able to conveniently ignore. And this novel is a way of trying to say, okay, what are the deeper things going on here? What's at stake? And where might all of this lead?
Wow.
And by the way, that was a long way of you ask, have I given up hope? And what I'd say is, I haven't given up hope But the kind of hope I have now is a little bit like the hope you have for an alcoholic or drug addict who is still drinking, still using, and you realize they're going to lose their marriage, they're going to lose their job, they're going to lose their career. But you know what? They might hit bottom and might get in a recovery program, and they might be able to start a new and better life on the other side. I haven't given up hope, but I think hitting bottom is not going to be easy or pleasant,
Right.
but it's way better than keeping on doing damage.
Right, right. Thank you for not letting yourself off the hook with the hope question because I had already moved on. But I appreciate your answer. That analogy is really, it's a tough one, but I get it.
Yeah.
I think about like the US economy, but like it's sort of like the water that we're all swimming in. Like, I
Yeah.
don't know that we think about it that much, let alone the global economy. Like
Yeah.
that to me, I think about the effects of what are these tariffs going to do? Is it really a good time to be starting a independent bookstore, Brian? I honestly don't know. We're part of the capitalistic system here with this little endeavor, but there obviously are good reasons why we're doing it to create a third place for people to gather in this community and share ideas and all of that. But my gosh, yeah, the collapse of the global economy, that's kind of beyond, I think, what anyone really on a day-to-day basis is even thinking about. We might be thinking about our local economy, the US economy to some degree, but yeah, that's really sort of like,
Well, for what it's worth, Steve, whatever happens to the global economy, local economies will become more important.
hmm,
Right now, local economies are at their sort of peak low importance because the global economy has dominated everything. But I think going forward, local economies are going to be important. And my guess is you know way more about that than you might realize. And that's what led you to do what you're doing with this beautiful bookstore and coffee shop, because creating places for people to connect locally is a big deal. And what also impresses me about what you're doing is you're doing that local face-to-face gathering place and you're doing a podcast because you understand that we live in both of these worlds. And this is the reality for all of us. We have to live in multiple worlds.
hmm.
And that's one of the reasons we're often very tired on a Friday night.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, what are some of your influences when it comes to fiction writing? What
Mm,
what what are you reading? What
yeah.
some of the authors or folks that you would recommend to other folks interested in books like The Last Voyage?
Yes. Well, first of all, for people who are not interested in science fiction, you could think of this as a character-driven novel because it is very much of a character-driven novel. And I was a lit major. I love literature. All my years as a pastor and working in the world of theology, that was enhanced because I had been a lit major. And when I read the Bible, I first understood that it was actually literature and not like theological textbooks as we might prefer. And I've loved literature since I was a kid. Science fiction, a lot of people don't consider it great literature, partly because it's a new genre, partly because it's a very popular genre, and partly because a lot of it is sort of pulp fiction, meaning, there's how many thousands of Star Trek novels come out, right? And it's because people get interested in a world. The great thing about science fiction is it creates worlds and it creates memorable characters. And so people want more and more of those memorable worlds and characters. But one of the things I love most about science fiction is it helps you imagine things you've never imagined before. Let me just give an example. There's an Episcopal priest who wrote a novel called Eden 2.0. And as I read this novel, she has a group of people going to a planet. When they get near to the planet, they find out that the planet itself has sentience and is able to communicate. In other words, all the living creatures of the planet have in some ways combined, a little bit like artificial intelligence. Their joint intelligence has developed the ability to communicate. Now, I never thought about a planet having sentience, having intelligence. And by the time I was done with the book, I was imagining living on a planet that has its own intelligence. And this moment dawned on me where I thought, the Earth has intelligence.
Mm.
And it took me imagining this other planet to see what's true of the planet I've lived on my whole life, right? Or I just read another incredible science fiction novel called Children of Time by Tchaikovsky. And this novel is, imagine a world where the most intelligent creatures are spiders, which sounds really creepy. But imagine if you had 8 legs rather than just 2 hands, right? And imagine if your primary art form is a web. What would a mind be like that didn't think in terms of twos, good and bad, us and them, but thought in terms of eights and thought in terms of webs? So it was this amazing way of having a species that had a form of reasoning that transcended our normal dualistic, simplistic reasoning. So at any rate, that's one of the reasons I've loved science fiction and so many incredible writers in this field.
Yeah.
And fantasy is closely related. I've loved fantasy, and I love sort of literary fiction as well. So, and I don't really think it's right to exclude science fiction and fantasy from literary fiction. I think they're one genre in literary fiction.
Tell me about writing a character like Colfax Innes.
Yes,
A lot of
uh,
big words, Brian.
yes, um, yes. Colfax. I wanted to create the most obnoxious lovable character I could. A character who is so insecure and so arrogant and so narcissistic and so full of himself and so flawed. And yet you still see he's a human being. And in many ways, readers will get a feel for what he evokes for them. But one of the central tensions in the first book, especially, is his relationship with his daughter, who he tried his hardest to turn into a mini me of him. And she had to make her decisions to be a different kind of a person. And the tension between them, of course, is one of the main storylines in the first book.
Are these all words that you know, or did you have to look up some of these? Let's be honest.
I tried to make his diction as pretentious and esoteric as I possibly could, and sometimes that involved using the thesaurus. But of course, Colfax is the kind of person who would use a thesaurus so he could impress people.
Right, right. Oh man. Well, you sort of hinted at where this trilogy is going. What's the timeline? This book is coming out now. There's two more, obviously. That's the definition of a trilogy. So the book two, The Great Rift, and book three, Ethnogenesis.
Yeah.
When can we expect these?
Yeah, I think book two will be late next year or early the following year, and then about a year for the third one as well.
Yeah. And you mentioned obviously you're working on more nonfiction as well.
Yes.
You have anything else in the nonfiction realm
Yeah,
in the
my next
pipeline?
nonfiction book will be out, I think, in the fall of 2026, and it is called The Beautiful Logic of a Meaningful Life. And it's really been a fun book. I'm just about a quarter of the way into it. But what I'm doing is I'm looking across a lifespan from conception to birth to childhood to adolescence to young adult, looking across the lifespan and talking about what contributes to a meaningful life.
Hmm. Beautiful. Will we see you at the Wild Goose Festival again anytime soon?
Unfortunately, when they changed the date for the Wild Goose Festival to a better date, I'm totally for changing the date, but I already had a commitment, so I'll be out of the country then. So this year I'll miss, but I love the Wild Goose Festival. Look forward to being back.
Yeah, yeah. Well, anything else that you want folks to know about the last voyage? What's the early feedback that you've been getting?
Well, I have to say it's been very moving. You mentioned Colfax as one of the main characters and Eve as one of the main characters. And someone who read who read the book contacted me and said she was in a board meeting for an organization she works with. And they were in a very difficult situation. And the first thought in her mind was, what would Eve do? And then a little later, she was sitting out on a deck, drinking a glass of wine, listening to birds, and thought Colfax would really enjoy this. So that made me feel good that the characters had sort of taken up lodging in her brain, in her imagination.
That's so great. Brian, I'm so grateful for the chance to talk to you. I'm excited to finish this. The writing is phenomenal. The dialogue is phenomenal. I'm so enjoying this, and I can't wait to read the whole trilogy. So thank you for the gifts that your books have been to me and to all of us throughout the years, and really excited to always read what's next.
Well, thanks so much and excited for you. All the best in this new venture and look forward to next time our paths cross.